Okay, this is lecture 5 of McGerr, A Fierce Discontent. Let's get our notes up here. Okay, so chapter 8 and chapter 9 is what we're on today. So chapter 8, McGerr talks about what he calls the pursuit of pleasure. Pursuit of pleasure is really the invention of the leisure industry. And so the invention of the leisure industry in the early 20th century, the working class had begun to carve out just a little bit of free time, a little spare time, and a little bit of extra money for their labors. Not all of the working class, to be sure, but a percentage of them had been able to negotiate lower working hours and a slightly higher income, so they had a little bit of disposable income. And so with this disposable income, it's the genius of capitalism, they find ways to tap into that. And so there is this whole flourishing of a leisure industry that did not exist previously. And so industries developed to profit from people having a little bit of extra time and maybe a little bit of extra money. And so you see a boom in sports, baseball in particular. You see a boom in the creation of parks, especially amusement parks, vaudeville theaters that are pitched at the ordinary working person as opposed to, let's say, the Shakespeare aficionado. So, and also the creation of Nickelodeons, which are small, short motion pictures in which people pay a nickel to view these films. And so these new entities flourished as a way for entertainment for people in their somewhat idle time. In referencing the sports, baseball in particular took off, but there was also other professional sports such as football and hockey. But you think about some of the storied baseball diamonds today. So Fenway Park was constructed in 1912. Fenway Park, as constructed, held 35,000 people. It's been since upgraded to hold a few thousand more. But a baseball stadium set up to hold 35,000 people suggests that there's the belief that they will get a fair number of people to fill it up, and at times even sell out, I guess, in playoffs or whatever. But the idea that large numbers of people are showing up. And so all these places are shared spaces, right? They're places where you have mingling of individuals and social groups. When you bought your ticket to get into Fenway, there are, to be sure, more and less expensive seats. So you could buy, your cheap seats up in the bleachers, or you could buy your prime seats behind home plate. But it's still one shared space. When you went to buy your beer or a hot dog, it's not like today where they have the super boxes where everybody is walled off. In these old spaces, it's a shared space. So you get in line to buy yourself a hot dog, you're in line with the person who's sitting behind home plate and the person who's sitting in the bleacher. There's a mingling of social groups, which did not occur previously, by and large. There was a lot of formal and informal mechanisms that kept social groups separated. While here in these amusement parks, at the World's Fair, your ticket buys you admittance to a shared space that everybody is in. And these minglings of social groups in these public spaces really begin to break down barriers between groups. There's this shared appreciation or shared enjoyment of the same spaces is opening up a mingling or a gathering together of people in ways that did not exist before. And this is true for the genders as well. So you have, in fact, the purveyors of these leisure industries worked extraordinarily hard to demonstrate that these were places that were safe, that you could send your unaccompanied children or your unaccompanied women in particular into these spaces, that they were a safe space. Again, thinking about the Victorian world, women had been crammed into the private sphere of the home world, while here this is breaking down, a part of the breakdown, bringing women and men together in shared public space in ways that were not considered proper before. And one of the activities they be engaged in was unmarried couples dancing. So this is about this leisure industry creating new shared spaces, one in which it helped to open the doors for women to escape the private sphere that they had been forced into and go out into the public. And a group that was particularly prominent in promoting the freedom of their movement in public sphere was a group known as Feminists. And one of the things that the Feminists were asserting was that they had equal right to both political norms, the suffragettes, as we shall see, but also as individuals, as citizens, right? So their freedom of movement, freedom to do as they see fit in public, not to be forced to do certain conventions as the larger society dictated. They wanted to take charge of their sexuality. So this is a period where you first begin you see the coining of the term birth control by Margaret Sanger. You see women who are in unhappy marriages pushing for divorce. They're asserting their rights as individuals, rights that they feel is their due, regardless of their gender. And this is also recharging the suffrage movement, which is the political movement to get the ballot, the vote, the franchise for women. The story of the suffrage movement is in the post Civil War period, when their hopes and expectations that the 15th Amendment would include gender were dashed. Women had the women's voting rights movement had kind of fractured into two main groups. These two main groups were pursuing different methods. One method was to lobby individual states, and so accumulate enough states that give women the right to vote, and then they could force for federal observance of that by making it national. The other group said we should attack this at the national level, and the local level or state level, it will take too long or be too ineffective. They didn't work together, and there was a lot of tension between the two groups, and so they failed to achieve their goals for a long period of time. In the late 19th century, they came back together. They re-knit into one national effort. They decided to abandon this piecemeal effort of state by state, and they focused on the federal effort. And so part of this focusing on the federal effort was to have a very prominent role in demanding their rights. So feminists and suffrage movement activists were very public. They demonstrated, they marched, as we shall see during the First World War. Their tactics were to put pressure on the White House, right? I should say that the feminists, although very public and very prominent, were still a very small number or a small percentage of the population who are out pushing the boundaries on what is considered proper behavior, I suppose. So at that time. So the feminists are not large in number, but their very public role brings these discussions, including the vote, into the larger public as issues of discussion and debate. They also, or this entire leisure industry, not just feminism, but this entire leisure industry and this new, this changing social mores in terms of gender relations, or people going out to enjoy themselves as opposed to just going out to work all the time. And the leisure industries that developed, amusement parks, the motion pictures in particular, they all generate a backlash. There are people who are upset by these rapid and wrenching changes, and they crusade against what they consider immoral behavior. So women drinking in public, right? So the saloon was seen as a place that was not suitable for proper women or proper young women in particular. So women who would drink in public were seen as, loose women. Women who were engaging in divorce, right? So we've already seen the progressives are, some measure of the progressives are decrying divorce as tearing the nation apart. The sexual freedom that women were demanding as part of their support for Margaret Sanger and birth control, and these desires to act like men are acting. As McGerr says, some progressives thought that the way that women had been, the standards that women had been held to before were things that the men should be brought up to, and that excusing male behavior in saloons and vice and prostitution, or visiting prostitutes and such things, and gambling and such things, instead of allowing other people to do it, we should discourage men from doing it to hold them to the same standards as women. But the younger progressive said, maybe we shouldn't deny the things that people find enjoyable. And so instead of trying to drag men up to women's level, maybe we should allow women to operate as individuals and as freely as men do. So this sort of backlash, it centers around drink, divorce, sexual freedom, and what they considered immoral or obscenity, particularly in film. The stories that were going on in the motion picture industry that people would crowd into to watch with their nickels at the Nickelodeon were all things that people found shocking. Too, as well, smoking in public was seen as very unladylike. And so cigarette companies actually undertook an effort to make women smoking in public socially acceptable, not because they're seeking to broaden the horizons of people viewing women in public as to make their own decisions, but because they wanted to sell more cigarettes. So the leisure industry is bringing out some tensions to that. And so one of the things about the leisure industry as well, though, is that it gave opportunity to people who would not have had opportunity. So you have McGerr talking about Christy Matherson, who was a famous pitcher. He's born to a middle-class family, working-class family in Pennsylvania. His track in life was thought to be going into the ministry, and then it turns out that he is a fantastic baseball pitcher and has a fantastic screwball that leads him to baseball success. So, baseball success, but then because this is the leisure industry and more people are paying attention to sports, he becomes a popular culture figure. And so he makes a lot of money, becomes very famous from playing a game, pitching baseball, right? And so a lot of things grow out of that, but this idea that his opportunity is made because of this burgeoning leisure industry is part of it. We also see it with movie stars. So these are ordinary people most times who end up, because of this mushrooming leisure industry and the revenue that it produces, they're moved out of their previous status. They become very famous. They move in very elite circles. They make a lot of money, all because this new industry is one in which they are thriving and succeeding in. This leisure industry allows lots of people to have greater opportunities, including the segregated populations like the Black population, who are placed into certain spaces now under Jim Crow and held in these spaces. But the leisure industry, for some, provides an opportunity to break out. But there is, however, a limit to what the leisure industry can do. And this is nicely illustrated by the story of Jack Johnson. So the leisure industry, even with this expansion of the leisure industry and new opportunities for folks and people in the audience, as it were, there are still limits. So Blacks can go to vaudeville theaters or go to movies, but they have to sit in a balcony. They're segregated within that shared space, right? Blacks could not go to the amusement park or the World's Fair on any day they wanted. There were certain days during the course of the season that were set aside for the Black population. So if a Black individual showed up on a day that they were, just a normal day at the amusement park, they were told, come back on the third Thursday. That's the day you can come to the park. Otherwise, you can't come in, right? So there are limits within this. Even in this shared space, there are segregated processes. And so then we have someone like Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson both illustrates the promise of the leisure industry, but also illustrates the limits imposed by segregation. So Jack Johnson was a heavyweight boxing champion, enormously successful. He was born to a sharecropper in impoverished status, but because of his pugilistic skills, he made quite a bit of money, so much money that he was able to move into spaces that would in normal circumstances be blocked from him. So he buys a mansion with his boxing winnings in elite Illinois lake property, right? So he's in a neighborhood that as a Black man, he would not be allowed to go into, let alone own a house. But because he's Jack Johnson, a very public and well-known boxing figure, and he has over the years amassed a substantial income from this for the purses that he commands. He's able to move through those spaces. He goes to restaurants, the finest restaurants in town, and everybody wants to come meet Jack Johnson because he's a great boxer, right? So he's able to go into these spaces that under segregation he would not be available for him to go into. And because of this leisure industry, he's able to do so. He's able to beat up white men. In the early 20th century, this is a very fraught thing. But because he's a boxer, he takes on the challengers. And in fact, the term, the Great White Hope, comes from efforts to find somebody to defeat Jack Johnson in the ring. And he pounded anybody who got in the ring with him. So he was a champion fighter. And the promoters loved this, right? So this ginned up more people for the show, right? He fought in front of very large audiences because the white population was wanting to find somebody who would beat this Black boxer, Jack Johnson, and they couldn't. So the purses that were generated from these boxing matches were very large, which Jack Johnson got a healthy cut from, right? Or at least a cut that allowed him to live a very healthy lifestyle. And so Jack Johnson was somebody who made a fortune in this leisure industry of boxing. And Jack Johnson lived out loud. So when he would go to the restaurant, he'd have a party of people, big table, they're all drinking champagne. And increasingly, Jack Johnson found that lots of women wanted to cavort with Jack Johnson because it was a rolling party. And it was the rolling party to be with Jack Johnson. And lots of women, some prostitutes, some not, some who knows, would go and party with Jack Johnson, and he would have these rolling parties wherever he went. Jack Johnson illustrates the limits to this. So he could beat up white men in public. That's really pushing the envelope. But because he's a boxer, he can do so. He can live in white neighborhoods. He can go expensive white neighborhoods. He can go to expensive restaurants and be served in the restaurant with every other patron, right? This too would be exceedingly unusual for these times. And so he can do all these things because of his success at the leisure industry. But when he starts spending time with white women, this is a bridge too far for early 20th century America. And so that's violating the limits of segregation that the white population is not willing to accept. And so Jack Johnson is arrested and on trumped up charges. He was arrested for violating what's called the Mann Act, which was bringing women across state borders for immoral purposes. It was primarily pitched at this myth of white slavery, which was a fear in early 20th century America that young white women were being snatched and forced into prostitution. And so it was really aimed at pimps, but that's not what Jack Johnson was. The women were going with Jack Johnson on their own volition, but the fact that some of them were white women was what was intolerable for the larger white society. So he was arrested and convicted on trumped up charges. And then again, nicely illustrating early 19th century American political corruption, he bribed the guards at the federal prison on his first day and walked out. And when he walked out, he had to flee the country. So he fled to Canada, he went over to Europe, and eventually drifted into Mexico, where he died broke and penniless. Jack Johnson was able to make a fortune to move into spaces that would be inaccessible to other African Americans, but those limits could only be stretched so far. So segregation still bound Jack Johnson, even though he had made a fortune in the leisure industry. And so this Jack Johnson story illustrates both the promise and the limits of these events. So the story of the Progressive Era is that it reaches its apex during the American involvement in World War I. And so a little bit about the background of World War I and how it relates to the progressives here is something that will help us understand this progressive, the arc to the progressive story. So the U.S. entered the war late. The war broke out in August of 1914, and it was a surprising set of events for all military watchers in Europe and diplomatic planners, and here in the United States. The expectation on all sides was that any conflict that would erupt in Europe between the European powers, and you had the Allied powers, which were the British, the French, and the Russians primarily. And then you had the Central powers, who were the Austro-Hungarians, the Germans, and the Turks. Any conflict that would break out between those two sides. Italy initially wavered between both sides and then ended up siding with the Allies. So any conflict that erupted between these empires in Europe, and the tensions between these European states were exceedingly high, were considered to be likely very short, sharp operations. And so the expectation was that a conflict would happen very quickly and would end very quickly. And so speed was sort of the planning mantra for the various military planners of these European empires. The idea was that the army that got to the field firstest with the mostest would win the conflict and would be able to resolve the peace treaty to their advantage. So game planning how to get your troops into the field first and with lots of stuff meant planning ahead for a conflict that nobody thought would happen, but they built into this system what would happen. And so what happens is these conflict ratchets up rapidly from a separatist movement within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Serbia had already carved out its own independent state from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Serbs were considered the little brothers to the Russians because they shared a similar Orthodox religion, similar languages. Serbs are Slavic as well. And so the Russians considered themselves the protectors of Serbian interests. The Austro-Hungarians were a multi-ethnic empire, but they had a sizable and very long-running German influence. And so the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans were closely allied. So when the Serbian separatist Principate tossed a grenade into the lap of Franz Ferdinand, assassinating the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the tensions for Austro-Hungary to punish Serbia, even though it was Principate was not part of the Serbian state, but was agitating for the rights of Serbs who remained within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This threat to Serbia from the Austro-Hungarians was matched by the threat of the Russians, who were looming to protect their Serbian co-religionists and co-ethnics. The Russians were allied with the French, and the French were allied with the British. The Austro-Hungarians were allied with the Germans. And a little bit about these empires is also pertinent information. The Russian Empire was a gigantic colossus, but was considered very slow moving. So they did not have the framework to get their army to the field firstest. And so the Russians always built into their planning that they would have to get a head start on any other states in mobilizing their forces. So the Russians began to mobilize because of their fears that the Austro-Hungarians would punish the Serbs, and they had pledged to protect Serbia. When the Russians began to mobilize, the Austro-Hungarians began to mobilize. And as the Austro-Hungarians began to mobilize, almost simultaneously, the German and the French empires began to mobilize because they feared that their opponent would get to the field first. And so they set in motion long honed plans to deliver men and material to a conflict against those folks on the other side of their alliance. And so what happened was that the conflict, there's a lot of literature about this, and we have a marvelous course, by the way, on two courses, actually, I believe, on World War I, various aspects of it. So I encourage you to take them. But the upshot is the conflict rapidly spun up into armed conflict. And instead of being a short, sharp war, it became a long grind of a war of attrition. The reason is because this conflict had become or was part of something that should have been visible and should have been understood at the conclusion of the American Civil War. The footage of the American Civil War, the siege of Petersburg, and the massive destruction of artillery and the need to dig trenches, all these things are part of the fact that the Civil War is an industrial war. It's a war where you're beginning to wed industrial production and delivery of materials into the function of slaughtering other people. World War I, the Great War, as it was referred to until an even greater war came and supplanted the title. The Great War was an industrial war where you had massive artillery bombardments, you had machine guns, a nice industrial term, that spew out so many bullets rapidly that any individual moving their life is at immediate peril. This rain of steel and lead and shot that these new industrial practices could deliver to the battlefield made it physically impossible to remain above ground for any length of time. So for their own protection, people dug holes to get out of this rain of steel. These holes became the trenches, and the trenches became locked into place. The battlefields of World War I, or especially on the Western Front, are locked into place. There's a little bit more movement on the Eastern Front with the German, Austro-Hungarians, Russians, and a little bit of the Turks involved. There's a little bit more movement in this conflict on the Eastern Front. But on the Western Front is also often referred to as a sausage grinder, in that it's firmly locked into place and meat is fed into it to be ground up, right? And then meat, in this case, it becomes people. So this conflict settles into a incredible, deadly war of attrition, in which the plan is to bleed out your enemy and to block them from attaining their goals by making it too deadly to move above ground, and then to kill as many of them as possible until they sue for peace. It becomes a total war in which the men and resources of all the empires are funneled into this conflict. Everything is dragooned into the conflict. And acquiring more stuff is of vital importance. The Allies have an advantage in terms of this, because in the Allies, the French, their ally across the English Channel is the British Empire, which is the most powerful navy on the planet. And so the most powerful navy at that time, and in fact, naval concerns were part of the sources of tension before the war. This newly emerging industrial power of Germany was threatening British interests and including their interests on the high seas. But the British Navy was superior enough to keep the German fleet bottled up. So the German fleet surface fleet could not compete with the British on the surface. But the Germans had also developed a new technology, or in large scale developed a new technology called the U-boat. U-boats are submarines, and so these U-boats were used to sink ships. And so they're much harder to fight by the surface navy, and they gave an advantage to the Germans in sinking ships. This conflict required increasing amounts of material input, guns, gunpowder, helmets, also shoes and tents, and lots of food, right? Because all these militaries need to be fed, and the farmers are at work, or the farmers' fields are being destroyed if you're French or someone in Central Europe. So all these places need food, and there's a place that has a lot of this stuff in production, right? So the United States becomes the producer of lots of things. These powers enmeshed in this grinding conflict, a conflict that stretches from 1914 into 1915, and from 1915 into 1916, where this attrition process is grinding on. So the United States becomes, under the new president elected in 1912, Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat who ran as a type of progressive. This United States becomes the seller of stuff. And Woodrow Wilson claimed and urged his countrymen to be neutral in thought and deed. And they said, we're not taking a side in this conflict, but if anybody wants to buy stuff, we certainly will sell it to them. Well, because the English Navy controlled the seas, German and Austro-Hungarian or Turkish ships couldn't ply the seas to come purchase stuff because the British would seize those ships. And so the Allies became the only consumer for American products. So over the course of the war, more and more of the United States materials are being delivered to the Allies, aiding them in their conflict with the Central Powers. And as the war of attrition is grinding on, the Central Powers are falling behind because they don't have access to the same type of stuff that the Allies do, primarily the American producing market, but also overseas. The French and the British had large overseas empires who were also funneling material to this conflict. So the United States starts off in neutral in thought and deed, but increasing their interests are aligned with the Allies because they're buying lots of stuff and they're buying lots of stuff on credit as well. Woodrow Wilson wins re-election in 1916 as the man who kept us out of war, but it's increasingly becoming harder for them to do so. And then events tip over into forcing us into the conflict. The Germans had, at the outset of the war, had unleashed their U-boats to sink any ships that were delivering goods to the Allies. But in doing that, they began to sink ships that U.S. Merchant ships that were traveling the seas, outraging the American public and the American government. And they began to, it's hard to tell what kind of ship you're shooting at from below the depths or below the waves of the ocean. And so sometimes they were sinking what were ostensibly passenger ships, most famously the USS Lusitania, in which lots of Americans were on these ships, not engaged in the war effort. So because there were increasing anger in the United States at the outset of this war about the U-boat practices, the Germans consciously dialed it back. They said, you know, this is something that we don't want to bring the U.S. in on the other side. So they dialed back their efforts at sinking ships to just the immediate areas around Great Britain and France. But the Germans recognized that they were in trouble by 1916 into approaching 1917. They were running out of stuff faster than their enemies. And the Germans were also fighting a two-front war that the British and the French were not, nor were the Russians, right? They were, the Austro-Hungarians had needed excessive German help, so the Germans were doing quite a bit of the fighting on the Eastern Front against Russia, while simultaneously fighting the French and British on the Western Front. So the German high command came up with a gamble, and they knew it was a gamble, but they saw no other way to get out of this box of attrition that was grinding them down. They decided they would try to knock the Russians out of the war by a massive assault. And when the Russians sued for peace, they would then load up all these Eastern Front soldiers and train them to the Western Front, where they would then unleash a massive assault on the British and French on the drive to capture Paris. That was their intent. And they believed once they captured Paris, the French would sue for peace, and they could negotiate terms to their favor as the victor in the war. They also recognized that they needed to shut off this torrent of goods that were supporting the Allies. And so that meant that they were going to have to ramp up and unleash their U-boat efforts to sink a lot more ships all across the Atlantic Ocean, not just around Britain and France. They also knew that this would likely result in them sinking U.S. ships and killing American sailors and American civilians, which is going to outrage the American public and will force the United States to enter the war because of this onslaught of sinking. And so this was part of the calculation. They knew the United States, or fully expected the United States, would enter the war on the side of the Allies, and that they would become a participant in the war. But they believed, the Germans did, or their gamble was, that they could capture Paris before U.S. support and delivery of men and material to the battlefront could prevent their victory. So it's a race against time, right? And so that's precisely what the Germans did. They unleashed an effort in the East to knock the Russians out of the war, including releasing and putting on trains some Russian radicals who were calling for revolution, in which they believed that overthrowing the government of Russia and installing a socialist government, one that favored the workers, would lead to Russia exiting the war, because the socialists were arguing this was a war for capitalists, right? And so they're successful. Inadvertently, the Germans sparked the Russian Revolution, eventually initiating a Russian civil war, which eventually the Reds or Bolsheviks won. And their leader, Lenin, who was the man delivered by the Germans to Russia to foment his goals for revolution. They knocked Russia out of the war. Russia sued for peace. They loaded up their folks and they threw them across to the Western Front. All these things were part of the intent. This unleashing of German U-boat efforts prompted American public outrage, and also the British intelligence officials had intercepted a German offer to Mexico, in which the Zimmerman telegram, as it was known, the German foreign minister offered to Mexico if they declared war against the United States, or at the very least remain neutral in the conflict. When the Germans succeeded, they would make as one of their demands for the post-war settlement that the United States give back everything it took from Mexico in the Mexican War of 1849. So that included big chunks of Texas, and included New Mexico, Arizona, all the way up to, and parts of Colorado, right? So these things, and parts of California too, if I recall correctly. So these things are released. The pressure on Woodrow Wilson to declare war increases. Wilson leads the nation in the war, and in April 1917, the U.S. has entered the war on the side of the Allies. But here's the problem. The United States is ill prepared for war, and Woodrow Wilson recognizes that he's going to need the aid of the progressives to rapidly prepare the United States for this effort. This war is a titanic operation in which a massive multi-million man army needs to be drafted, mobilized to the locations where they will be trained, delivered to the coasts where U.S. and Allied shipping would then deliver them to the war front in Europe. This is an incredibly large and complex effort that the United States had virtually no preparation for. And so Wilson recognized he was going to need the management expertise of progressives in order to do this most efficiently, because time was not on their side. And so it's similar to Civil War, as we saw at the beginning of this class. The Civil War required an activist state, a state where the federal government takes the lead in managing these events. And these types of management operations are exactly what the progressives had been arguing about, right? And so Wilson enlists the aid of the progressive. I should also note that one of the things that progressives found attractive is that this would be their opportunity to manage people as well, right? So they could help make make people good Americans as well, as they saw this effort to manage the affairs of individuals, all working for the common goal of the nation. One of the clearest embodiments of this idea of the progressives being wedded to this effort is something known as the War Industries Board. And the War Industries Board is a committee, a small committee of experts who are designed, or who are charged with maximizing the efficiency of the United States effort to prepare and deliver material for the war. These group of experts are going to be dispassionately evaluating what is the wisest course for the nation in this war effort, right? And so they are given oversight and control over the major sectors of the American industrial and agricultural production. They're charged with controlling these things and maximizing their productivity. And I'll give you an example. So And I'll compare and contrast to a capitalist system, right? Let the market determine these things, right? So there is an enormous demand for steel, right? Far more steel than the nation's steel plants could produce. And so the demand would greatly outstrip the supply of steel. Under a capitalist system, the market system, the person who pays the most for this scarce commodity gets to buy the commodity. So we'll put shipbuilding in there. Shipbuilders need all the steel they can get because the United States is going to have to deliver millions of men across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. That's going to require lots of ships. They're going to have to deliver all the equipment and supplies that are needed for those millions of men delivered to the battlefield. That's going to be included. They're going to need all the ships to deliver, the munitions that are necessary and the armaments that are necessary for this. They're going to have to continually ship over new people and bring over more material. So the American shipbuilding industry needs to get its hand on every bit of steel that it can. And even that steel will not be sufficient to fill this demand. So the demand for steel in the shipping industry is very large, and maybe large enough that they could take every scrap of steel. If they're paying the top dollar under the market-driven system, they will get every scrap of steel. So we'll have lots of ships being built. But in terms of mobilizing for the war, that's not the most efficient use. Most efficient use would give shipbuilding as much steel as could be spared to go to shipbuilding. But we also need steel for making howitzers. We also need steel for making locomotives to deliver this material to the ports to put on the ships. You need steel for the helmets that are being stamped out for each individual soldier. You need steel for the bullets that go into these weapons that are being fired. You need steels to manufacture trucks that are going to schlep people around, or cars, or anything. Steel has a multitude of uses in the war effort. If it's left to the market, that would lead to a distortion where certain deep-pocketed sectors of the industry would get all the steel, and these other things would have no access to steel that are also vital for the war effort. That's where the War Industries Board comes in. The War Industries Board is going to allocate these scarce resources in the most efficient manner. So they're going to give some to shipbuilders because they need all the steel they can get. They're going to give some to railroad manufacturers because we need the locomotives. They're going to give some to howitzer producers. They're going to give some to truck builders, right? And so by spreading this scarce material around at the same time trying to gin up increased production from steel mills is the most efficient use of this scarce commodity. And this is true for all commodities. The volume of material that will be demanded for this war effort is so large that it's outstripping any and all supplies of anything. And so the War Industries Board, this is perfect progressive thinking. A small group of experts is going to manage this. Within the War Industries Board, the War Industries Board is driven by efficiency, right? Maximizing efficiency to produce and serve the United States war effort, right? Well, one of the things that threaten efficiency are strikes. If the workers go out on strike, let's say if the workers in the coal mine go out on strike to make more money, right? And coal production shuts down, that's going to block up everything in this war effort, right? From producing steel, from delivering steel, from making ships, from everything, right? So everything will be threatened by a strike in the coal sector, let's say. Strikes will adversely impact the efficiency of this war effort. And so within the War Industries Board, they adopt a practice, right? They develop something known as the National War Labor Board because they recognize that workers have complaints, right? And that these complaints sometimes are legitimate. And if the only way that the workers can make their complaints heard is by going on strikes, that's going to mess up the efficiency. So the National War Labor Board is created to hear the complaints of workers and to hear the complaints of collections of workers known as a union. And they will hear these complaints, and they will then seek input from the companies where the complaints are being lodged. And they are empowered, the National War Labor Board, to rule on the claims from the workers or the companies, and then to enforce them. This is placing the United States government in a role of not only allowing workers to work collectively, but serving as a venue for adjudicating the disputes between workers and owners. The War Industries Board also is seeking to induce owners to work with their workers by giving them very generous contracts for the material being produced for the war, and also including in that that the companies will pay their workers more, right? So they're going to seek to aid the workers in how they draft these contracts for the companies. The companies are making a pretty penny on producing this war material. This is not done by coercion or as a matter of charity. This is a profit-driven enterprise for these corporations. The government is consciously seeking to harness the power of capitalism to produce this stuff by saying, you're going to make more money the more you produce. But they also put into that, you're going to share some of this money with the workers because they don't want the workers to go on strike, right? You also see, as part of this progressive effort, the efforts to remake individuals by, as they say, getting rid of the hyphen between Italian Americans or Irish Americans or Ukrainian Americans by removing that hyphen and making them good Americans. So they're going to remake individuals into what they see is the ideal way, good middle-class Americans who adopt the policies of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? And so from this polyglot mix of immigrants, the idea is that they're going to produce good Americans in which they're going to be patriotic and supporters of the war effort. Now, within this effort, there's also coercive elements where they're going to criminalize things such as trading with the enemy or speaking out against the war, right? So these things are also coercive elements of inducing people to support the war effort, to meld them into one group, all pulling in the same direction, right? These are sort of the efforts by the government, what they're doing. But these efforts, which rely upon ratcheting up American or nationalist identities and patriotism, also has a spin-off effect. One of the spin-off effects is that it spurred people to act in ways of enforcing this drive to be good, loyal Americans, self-defined. So individuals decide they know what it means to be an American, and they're going to force other people to act in that fashion, right? And so the American Protective League is a group of folks who self-identify as what being an American means, and they're going to force other people to act in that fashion, which means they're going to enforce that people who speak German don't speak the language of our enemy. And in fact, there was a case where a German speaker in St. Louis was lynched because he spoke German, right? There is the American Protective League took it upon itself to spy on their neighbors to see if anybody was acting in a disloyal or supporting the enemy fashion, right? So they took it upon themselves because they're spurred on by the government to support the war effort and to support Americanism, and so they decide they're going to do it themselves. Radical action like and radical organizations like the Wobblies, the International Workers of the World, the American Protective League, or folks with that sort of super self-identity of good, loyal Americans, are going to determine what other people are doing. So if the Wobblies are talking about organizing or going on a strike, they're going to break it up because they consider it un-American activity. The government went to great efforts to engage the public through public information campaigns. which they're propagandizing the war, right? So there's a lot of talk about German atrocities, the evil Hun, things like that. And it also takes the form of renaming things that have the origins in Germany or Austro-Hungary or Turkey or things like that, where now the people identified as the enemy, their sort of cultural norms have to be eradicated from the nation, right? So sauerkraut is renamed Liberty Cabbage. What used to be known as German toast is renamed French toast. A hamburger is renamed Liberty Steak. So those are sort of the sort of superficial and silly things, but they also illustrate this idea of changing everything to be a good modern American way. And one of those things that grows out of this as well is prohibition, right? So prohibition is, it's wastefully using grains to distill it into liquor. Beer makers, beer is made by people who are who have the names of our enemies. So it's Anheuser-Busch, it's Schlitz, it's Pabst. These are German names because German brewers brought their technology to the United States and captured a lot of the beer market, right? And so all these things are things that are undermining the war effort, and they need to stop. And so this too is an outgrowth of this wedding together of progressives and the war effort. But this also, you know, these sorts of opportunities and pressures that folks took advantage of also generated things that worked out for part of the population. So with the onset of the war, the National Women's Party, which was the melding together of these previous suffrage movements, began radical protest outside the White House to put pressure on the Wilson administration to support passing a constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote. Wilson was none too fond of this at first or through the duration. In fact, women were arrested for demonstrating outside the White House and were in prison. Some of them went on hunger strikes and were force-fed. And so they were badly mistreated in the prisons, but women continued to agitate for the right to vote, protesting outside the White House at the time when Woodrow Wilson was promoting a new world order in which democracy was one of the key linchpins of what he called his 14 points, right? Global democracy, well, women, the suffrage movement actively pointed out that here at home, more than 50% of the population did not have the right to vote. And so Wilson eventually caved under this pressure. He said that women had demonstrated their civic virtue by aiding in the war effort and supporting things and should be rewarded with the vote. A good chunk of this was also the effectiveness of women in pointing out the hypocrisy that Wilson was kind of forced to support it. So he backed the 19th Amendment and called it vital to winning the war, right? And so by tagging it as vital to winning the war and putting his political support behind it, he was able to get it through the Congress and out into state legislatures to, as we know, the amendment process requires a vote from the American public on this issue. And so with his backing, the 19th Amendment narrowly squeaked through, right? Granting the women the right to vote, but that first election would not come until later for women, right? But it's part of the war effort, as Wilson calls it, and it's his support that gets it over the hump and that final hurdle to get it passed into a constitutional amendment. So here in the American war effort, we see the pinnacle of progressive dreams. They're controlling the economy of the nation and having it move in a way which they consider one that benefits the nation the most, not benefiting private capitalists, although they're making money hand over fist, but the managing of the effort to efficiently produce material, that's a progressive dream. They're reshaping people, right? reshaping them to become good Americans as they see it. So, you know, they get Prohibition through. There's a portion of the progressive movement who sees whiskey as an evil. And so they get control of that, right? And their greatest impact is right here during this war effort. And then their success in managing so many different parts of American life and the American economy prompted a backlash, right? People saw this progressive effort of management and this very active federal government, both nationally and internationally, as something that is not the best goal, right? And with the conclusion or the armistice, the ceasefire, November 11th, 1918, the war ends, although a peace treaty has not been signed yet. And so in the peace that follows this, this progressive success, there's an enormous amount of backlash. People resent the federal government's intrusion into their private lives. Workers are seeking to expand their opportunities that were given to them under the National War Labor Board to continue to form unions, but a great percentage of the public still sees unions as radical activity and are unhappy with that. This Americanism that was unleashed to support the war effort continues to run amok. And you see it's during this time in the immediate aftermath of the war that there's this vast expansion of the Ku Klux Klan reaching its largest numbers in 1921. There is 1919, that winter after the cessation of war in November of 1918. There's a vast, it's called the Red Scare, in which there's a fear that the communist revolution of Russia is going to break out here in the United States, and people see lots of union efforts and strikes. 1919 was a particularly high year for people going on strike. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of racial violence. There's several notable race riots that occur. There's just this enormous fear that the nation has been transformed and people resent it. The Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer is an ambitious fellow who plays up fears of these Red Scare issues to arrest a lot of people he considers radicals and communists. He seizes upon the fact that somebody tried to blow him up by mailing him a bomb to arrest hundreds of people around the country and thousands of people, actually. And he puts hundreds of them on a boat and ships them to Russia. And so there's this great tumult and turmoil and fear that is roiling American society in 1919. This is also going to be the run-up to an election year in 1920. So as these tensions continue, there's a lot of dissatisfaction and violence, right? Why don't we stop there, and then I'll pick up with a short lecture talking about the conclusion of McGerr's book and the end of the progressive era next time.